All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I am Susan Bean, our Community Engagement Director here at MountainTrue. And this is another installment of our webinar series we're calling MountainTrue University, where we have highlighted different members of our staff and sometimes guest speakers talking about various environmental sustainability issues facing our region, the Southern Appalachians. And right now, this summer, we've been doing a specific series on climate change and how each of our core program areas are responding to the effects of climate change from either mitigation strategies or adaptation to the changes that are already happening. Thanks for coming. If you have questions during Chris's presentation, please use the Q&A feature in the sort of panel or navigation menu at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type those in anytime throughout the presentation, and we will likely get to them at the end. But if you have a timely question about a particular map or graphic, we can interrupt Chris for sure and field those. So please use that anytime. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Chris Joyell, the director of our Healthy Communities program here at MountainTrue, who is expert in all things design and planning and land use, transportation, et cetera. And he will talk about how our Healthy Communities program is responding to climate change in our area. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks so much, Susan, and welcome all. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be talking about how MountainTrue is planning to adapt and mitigate for climate change in the built environment, and that's mainly the area that I focus on is the place where we spend the vast majority of our time. It'll be a little bit Asheville centric. And that's because we have some really good data to work with and some great examples to show of how we're anticipating changes, climatic changes, and how they're going to impact this region. So to start off, just to, oh, that didn't work. Let me see. There we go. Just to give folks a little bit of an introduction. My name is Chris Joyell. I'm the director of the Healthy Communities program, and previous to joining MountainTrue, I was the executive director of the Asheville Design Center from 2008 until 2017. We merged with MountainTrue in 2017, and really because I think MountainTrue is one of the very few environmental organizations that saw the connection between the built environment and our natural environment, and recognized that if we build livable places, places where people want to locate, like Asheville, we're going to have a much better time managing that growth within our cities, where our services, our infrastructure, our jobs, where they exist, and perhaps make it a little bit easier for the rest of our staff here to protect the natural environment that we cherish so much in this region. So I'm going to walk us through a little bit of the growth patterns that we've seen in Western North Carolina leading up to today, and then we'll take a look forward and think about how climate change is going to drive the growth in this region. You're looking at a land use map dated back in 1976, and the developed areas are shown in light yellow, and it's kind of really faint and hard to see, but for those that remember Asheville back in the 70s, it was a very sleepy town. So the map doesn't really surprise a lot of folks that have been here for a long time. As we zoom up about 30 years, you can just see the influx of development in Western North Carolina. You see a lot of creep coming in from the Charlotte area. But really what I wanted to focus on was within Buncombe County, you can almost see this XY axis form of development that starts to follow the corridors of I-40 and I-26. And that's to be expected. We see a lot of our growth patterns tend to follow our transportation networks, and we should assume that that's only going to continue in the future. As we jump ahead another 25 years, we now see projections for growth, and you can really start to see how the metro region of Asheville begins to expand and almost starts to close the gap between Hendersonville and Asheville. That corridor just really begins to we see a lot of density popping up in that area. Keeping that in mind, it's really helpful to think about how what factors are driving that type of growth. And certainly one factor is our Tourism and Development Authority has a very healthy budget for marketing. And we've seen an influx in tourism here, particularly in the last 5 years, where our TDA has had a budget of about 15 million to market Asheville, and they've been doing a really good job of marketing it to many of the communities that I think are going to be impacted by global warming more severely than we will up here in the mountains. So in the flatlands of South Carolina, Florida, Tennessee, a lot of folks are learning about Asheville, and as they learn about Asheville and as they come to visit, a lot of folks decide that this would be a wonderful place to live, to relocate, to perhaps retire. And we're going to see a lot of, I think, growing development pressure in our area. We also know that our metro region, what's known as the land to sky region, is approaching tipping 500,000. When we get to a population of 500,000 in this area, which is projected for 2025, for a lot of industries and for a lot of businesses, that puts us on the map. 500,000 puts us across a threshold that suddenly makes it much more inviting for, say, companies like Pratt & Whitney to locate in this region. So I think as we cross that threshold, we're only going to see an acceleration in growth. And what I want to do today is really talk about how can we prepare for that growth and how are we best suited to adapt to that growth that's going to be driven by climate change. So we're looking at some projections now for growth in our region. I think it's really helpful. You're looking at, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'll float us over Buncombe County. Buncombe County is projected to have about 25 to 50% growth in the next 15 years. And I think it's safe to say that it's probably going to be a little bit more than that. We're expected to see, we typically experience about 1.5% growth in the county from year to year. It fluctuates a little bit, but that's basically adding about 1,000 to 1,500 people every year to our region. Just to keep it in perspective, you can see in the triangle, as well as in the Charlotte area, they're experiencing staggering growth compared to what we have. And so for all the growing pains that I think we're experiencing here in Asheville, it's good to keep it in perspective. That there are a couple other regions in our state that are experiencing much more growth. What we all tend to be sharing in common, though, is that growth seems to be coming from outside North Carolina. It's what we call in-migration growth. On this chart, you'll see that even within our metro region of Asheville, we're actually expected to lose our natural population. Will actually decline a little bit as we're not adding to the population pool internally. Instead, what we're going to see, and as many regions in North Carolina, it's folks moving to the area that are really adding to our population. And for Asheville, it's almost exclusively this in-migration pattern that we're seeing of people moving from out of state into Asheville that's going to grow our population. As we look a little bit more, tightly at the metro region itself, you can just see where that growth is going to be experienced primarily here in Buncombe County and Henderson County. As we saw on that map, the corridor between Hendersonville and Buncombe County really just start to fill out. But we're also beginning to see a lot of growth in Haywood as well. Canton, I saw recently, Canton tagged itself as the West Asheville. It's a fast-growing region, and it's located on that I-40 corridor, so it's natural to expect that type of growth to start to pop up in counties like Haywood. So the factor that I think is really the X factor when we think about how much growth can we expect in our region and where will it be coming from is really when we think about the impacts of climate change. As we've seen recently, as Florida continues to experience ramped up hurricanes and coastal areas of South Carolina and North Carolina, the Gulf Coast in general, as temperatures begin to climb, we're going to find more and more people looking to move to a more suitable climate. And Asheville presents a really, a great climate for adapting to climate change. For that reason alone, you can see on this map that there is an estimate that we're going to be adding about 50,000 people to our just to the city itself over the next 60 years. So that's really a 50% jump in our population. And the question that we have to keep asking ourselves as as we go through this presentation is, how will people move around in this community, and where are they going to live? That's a lot of people to be able to squeeze into a city that really does no longer has the ability to annex. We can't grow by absorbing new developments on the edges of our town that are tapping into our water system. The state legislature has taken that ability away from Asheville. So we're not going to be able to really grow by geographically expanding. And there certainly seems to be a lot of resistance to growing up and adding stories to our buildings and trying to kind of retain this, I think, this quaint notion of Asheville as a sleepy mountain town. So we're going to be faced with a real challenge of trying to figure out where are we going to put 50,000 people in the next, call it 50 years. All that, none of this is taking into consideration, say, like a growing budget from our TDA and advertising Asheville to more and more people in areas being impacted by climate change, and seeing Asheville as this refuge where they can get some elevation and get out of the way of the extreme impacts of climate change that we expect to see in Southeast America. So, if we're going to talk about infrastructure, it only seems natural that we start with the I-26 connector. It is the project that brought the design center into being, and it's one that I want to talk about here because I think it will really shape the next 50 years of growth in our area, and it's important to just get a sense of the scale of what's coming our way. So this is a look at a new highway construction. This would all be north of the Bowen Bridge in Asheville, where we cross over the French Broad River. Currently, the Bowen Bridge carries I-26, I-240 traffic, and Patton Avenue local traffic across that bridge into downtown, and then disperses traffic on I-26 and I-240 on the east side of the bridge. As part of DOT's proposal right now, they recommend taking all the highway traffic off the Bowen Bridge and moving it about a half mile north to basically the area that you see on the east bank of the French Broad River. Just to give you a perspective of where that highway will be landing, that's around where the salvage station is. But just to take in the sheer size of this project, I think it's really important to note just the scale of this project, and one that right now I-26 is reduced to a single lane as you come off of the Bowen Bridge, and here we're looking at potentially 4 lanes in either direction, and that really does open up the fire hose to development outside of Asheville as well, because it's only going to make it much easier to come in and out of Asheville when you have a much more expanded highway to allow for that traffic and to absorb the volumes that it may induce. So I mentioned that this was how the design center got started back in 2006. A group of architects, landscape architects, planners, engineers, graphic designers came together because they were dissatisfied with the plans that DOT had put on the table for an I-26 connector that did not remove any highway traffic from the Bowen Bridge, and we decided to come up with a plan ourselves that would do that. We had a storefront right off of Pritchard Park on College Street, where we invited the public every Wednesday night to come in and explore ideas with us, and we kept all those maps up on the wall to try to be as transparent and accessible as possible. We had a ton of community input. We were drawing from a rich history of discussion around the I-26 connector, and we tried to achieve all the goals that were set out in the late 90s by the Community Consensus Committee that had set up goals for the I-26 connector, and one of them primarily was to remove that highway traffic from the Bowen Bridge and allow us to be able to recapture a significant chunk of property in our downtown that currently is occupied by on-ramps and off-ramps and connectors to I-240. So within that orange circle, you're seeing about 60 acres of land that is currently being used and controlled, owned by DOT. That had been at one point, part of the Weekend neighborhood and a part of Stumptown, part of the Montford neighborhood, and has really become a no man's land. So when you are downtown and you want to try and direct someone to the River Arts District from downtown, it can get really confusing. But what we had envisioned was how easy would it be if we could just point people west and just say follow Patton Avenue all the way to the river. We see an incredible infill opportunity in a land that is that will no longer be necessary. DOT will not need to control that land once we reroute I-26 and I-240 traffic off the bridge, and as I had mentioned further north, it does free up a significant chunk of land that we can use to extend our downtown, because our downtown is not going to be able to grow east. We have the mountain, Bowcatcher Mountain, standing in the way. It's going to be very difficult for us to expand north or south because we have roadways, Merriman and Biltmore primarily, that are pretty much maxed out and going to be very difficult to add more density to those corridors. So the most natural area for our downtown core to expand is going to be going westward towards West Asheville and towards the Bowen Bridge. And in reclaiming that land, we have a real opportunity to bring all forms of affordable housing, office space, and retail to expand that downtown core along Patton Avenue. That was our original vision, and that was one that we held to for almost a decade before DOT finally acquiesced and was willing to consider our alternative. That was in 2016. In 2018, they ended up selecting our alternative, and now we're working with that design. So we're thrilled that we're able to see some progress on that, and I want to be able to give you a little bit of an idea of where DOT was going with that. So, we had this image of connecting downtown to the bridge through a dense urban corridor, replicating what we already experienced on Patton Avenue in the downtown area. But instead, DOT came back with what really resembled more of a suburban highway. It was with travel speeds of up to 45 miles an hour, a separated lanes, and really posing significant obstacles for pedestrians to be able to cross a road like that. Again, we also have on-ramps and off-ramps directly into Patton Avenue onto 240 that eat up a lot of land and require a lot of room to be able to absorb traffic coming off the highway. So everything that you see in yellow here is new roadway that is being proposed by DOT, and the gray underneath that would go away. That's the existing roadway in shaded gray. When we saw these designs, we were happy to see that DOT had gone in the direction of separating local from highway traffic, but we were not thrilled with the roadway that they were presenting us, because we just recognized that it was just out of context with a downtown like Asheville to suddenly basically drop a suburban highway into this setting. And we really wanted to scale that back. So, we took a look at what kind of land would be available if DOT had gone ahead with their plans. And we came away with maybe 6 acres of developable land. But even if we were to develop it, we weren't sure that it would function necessarily the way that we would want it to for an urban corridor. So we engaged the community. We engaged the WeCan, the Hillcrest, and the Montford community, and we brought together a team of designers to work with community representatives to explore a charrette of how could this area of land between the Bowen Bridge and the Klingman intersection, how could it be redeveloped in a way that would really allow for our downtown to grow the way we intended. What we came up with was a design that actually opened up almost 13 acres of land for redevelopment. It provided a direct connection for the Hillcrest community that you see on the left-hand side here. Hillcrest has been isolated from the rest of our community with a one-way in, one-way out access point off of Cortland. That made it really difficult for people to be able to access, regular bus lines on Patton Avenue. It was kind of one of those can't get there from here situations for Hillcrest members, and we wanted to provide a direct connection to Patton Avenue for the Hillcrest community. Just from a public transit standpoint alone, it just gave an incredible opportunity. And then any development that we saw in this corridor would be directly accessible to the Hillcrest community. So we also looked at potential north-south connections between Hill Street and Hilliard. And you'll see in number 2 where you see this roundabout, we saw real value to creating a north-south connection and giving people an alternative way to get down to the River Arts District and to the hospital, rather than having to go all the way up to the Klingman Circle over here in number 4. We thought that there would be a potential to bypass that and give people a chance to cut down Hilliard. And connect onto to Clingman Avenue that way. So we presented DOT with these ideas. They were, I will say, DOT has come a long way in the 15 years or so that we've been working with them. And they were really willing to work with us and try and find ways to accommodate these changes. Now, their first pass at it, I think, missed the mark on several counts. They did keep the roundabout that we wanted. They did keep some of the north-south connections in a little bit of a way. And they do provide a little bit more of a direct connection for the Hillcrest community to Patton Avenue. Still not ideal, but I think it's better than what was being proposed, which was bringing them all the way to the north end of their property and then accessing a service road all the way back to Patton Ave, which basically would give some residents almost a half a mile round trip just to get about 100 yards as the crow flies. So we're providing a little bit more of a direct connection, but as you'll see in the bottom of this map, there's a waggle that they include the Patton Avenue. And that's something that just does not work for us from a redevelopment standpoint. It takes away any opportunity to develop on the south side of Patton Avenue. And anyone that has experienced successful retail on the road level recognizes that you need to have that retail on both sides of the road. You need to be able to give people eye candy on both sides of the road to really attract people to a retail area. And you're not going to get that if you eliminate any forms of development on one side of that road. So we have, and I can say that we have a more updated design that I don't have a copy of with me right now, but we were able to straighten out Patton Avenue. We were able to present opportunities for redevelopment on either side of the road. And I think that we're getting closer now to scaling this project down to really what it needs to be, a human scale project, not necessarily a project designed for cars and trucks, but designed for the people that live here, and give us the opportunity to have infill development that will really extend our urban core all the way to the river. So this gives you a little bit more of this was a vision that we had back in 2007, I think, that we came up with this vision. But you can see at the top of your screen, that's the existing view of the Bowen Bridge looking east towards downtown, and below is our vision for what the Bowen Bridge could become. And you can see how that corridor just extends all the way to downtown, with plenty of shade and plenty of bike and pedestrian access. We even threw a streetcar in there just to kind of give a callback to Asheville's history, having the second largest streetcar system in the United States at one point. But I am thrilled to say that we are able to reduce the lanes on Bowen Bridge. Since we've removed the highway traffic from the bridge, we now are able to go down to 2 lanes on either side of the bridge for automobile traffic, and that frees up 1 lane on either side of the bridge for full-fledged greenway construction. To give you a little bit of an idea, here's just some of the plans. If you're looking at the very top of the screen, you're seeing what you would be experiencing coming off the Bowen Bridge. And as it transitions onto land and onto what we would call East Patton Avenue, you get a little bit more. You can see bike lanes and pedestrian right away, and I'll give you a little bit close-up of what that cross-section looks like. But that's the cross-section that you can expect for East Patton Avenue. As you come from the bridge and you work your way towards downtown. We have a 10-foot use multi-use path. We have a dedicated bike lane that's separated from traffic and buffered. I think it's going to create a really rich experience for people that are going to try and get from downtown to the River Arts District and across the bridge into West Asheville as well. It also is going to connect into a really rich system of greenways that are in development right now, some existing and some that will be delivered with the highway project itself. So we're going to see, I think, a whole new level of connectivity for bikes and pedestrians throughout our downtown and the River Arts District and leading into West Asheville. This is an incredible opportunity. It's a great way to take more cars off the street, and I think it's going to be a real positive for our community going forward. So that's the highway project in a nutshell. It's really kind of, as you can imagine, it's much more sprawling in some ways and involves a lot more. We did see the project get bumped up by a couple of years with the pandemic. And so now the deadlines that we're looking at are you could probably add 2 years to each one of these deadlines that you see on the left. Section B in the northern section. That is the I-26 connector and the Bowen Bridge, and where we've dedicated a lot of our time. We don't really anticipate that kicking off until 2022 at the earliest. But DOT is now in the process of acquiring land and finalizing the details for this section of highway. So, as we kind of wrap up the discussion around that piece of infrastructure, a very obvious piece of infrastructure with highway construction, it's important to think that where are all those highways leading to, and when we talk about this influx of population that's going to be coming to our region, where are they going to live? And all roads lead to home. So let's talk about home. Let's talk about the housing crisis that we face right now in Asheville. Last year, we hosted, as part of our Building Our City Speaker Series, back on March 6th, we hosted Patrick Bowen, who had just conducted an affordable housing survey of the Land of Sky region, the 4 counties that comprise Land of Sky, with a specific focus on Buncombe County. And then he came back. He had done that research in 2015 and then came back with an update in 2019. So we hosted him in the very beginning of 2020. Really just about a week before everything shut down for the pandemic, and he presented to us his findings. None of this is going to be news to you. If you live in Asheville, you already know that we are in a severe housing crisis. But what he really highlighted was the skyrocketing cost of housing in our area, where we saw just over the course of a decade, the median household price just shot up. Nearly 100% increase in some cases, and at the same time, what we're seeing is a depletion of supply, particularly for houses below 300,000, and that's really where we're looking to focus. That affordable housing segment. The availability in 2014 compared to the availability in 2019, we saw a dramatic drop in availability, and so there's been a real pinch. Particularly in the affordable housing segment, just in ownership. Now, we're not even talking about rental properties, where we see now almost 50% of people renting in Buncombe County that are paying over a third of their income towards rent, and that's something that we typically do not want to see. That puts a lot of stress on a household, but we know that there are a lot of households that are really experiencing a lot of stress in paying their rent and being able to deal with the extreme shortage. We don't have time to really go into Airbnbs and how that's impacting the rental market and the housing market, but just trust me that it is. But where I wanted to focus today was really on the issue of single family zoning. So zoning itself came into being in America about 100 years ago in New York, when there was this interest in segregating uses and really segregating the industrial, the commercial, and the residential uses, and using it as a justification. The justification was for safety, and it withheld Supreme Court scrutiny. The court saw zoning as an extension of the police power of a municipality in protecting the health and welfare of its residents. So zoning was seen as a key instrument in providing for the health and welfare of its community. For the most part, the segregation of uses was, just as I had mentioned, just kind of commercial, industrial, and residential. The distinction between multifamily and single-family residential use didn't really start to emerge until post-World War II. And in the 1950s, we really saw zoning take off. That's when it really took root here in Asheville as well. But that's also when we saw an expansion in our interstate system, and we saw what led to an explosion in suburban growth. I have an image here of Levittown and America's infatuation with the single detached family home. It really grew out of the 50s, and the concept of having your own plot of land and your own standalone home was really kind of a new concept in the 50s. But it was made possible by a number of different financial incentives, like the GI Bill, as well as, like I mentioned, the expansion of the interstate system that suddenly made areas that were more rural and out of reach of metro areas much more accessible. So in Asheville, this is just a fraction of our city's zoning map, but you can see that we have a whole bunch of different uses laid out here. But what I really wanted us to focus on are at the very bottom here. You see there's these three designations of low, medium, and high density single family use. It's really difficult to tell on this map because the colors are so subtle, I think. But if we were to kind of single it out a little bit more, um, the story that it tells is that of the available residential land that we have within Asheville city limits, 66% of that land is designated, or I believe 68% of that land is designated for single family zoning. Now, I mentioned that single family zoning was a relatively new construction within the zoning world, and particularly in the 1950s. What we find is that single family zoning tends to overlap very much with more affluent neighborhoods. And multifamily zoning, and it's really difficult to see on this map, but multifamily zoning tends to overlap with areas that had historically been redlined. Redlining was a practice used by the banks and the federal government to classify what communities were safe to make for banks to make investments in, and which communities were risky. And those that were circled in red were deemed the most risky. And really, through no coincidence, those communities that were circled in red were more often than not African American communities. So we're finding that many of the historically African American communities are zoned for multifamily. Many of the historically white communities in Asheville are now zoned single family. And in many ways, it works to segregate communities by income, and because of the income distribution here in Asheville, it also tends to be very racially segregating as well. So I think within the single family zoning designations, we see a subtle form of discrimination that's been able to be carried out throughout the 50s and up to present day. And there's, what has become, what is forcing us to look at is a very limited scope of housing choices available to us today. Minneapolis recognized this problem recently, and in their own planning process, they were going through a comprehensive planning process. They were able to identify that of their residential land, 70% of that land was designated for single family zoning, and they recognized that as a significant barrier to the African American community. And they went about and did something really precedential, and they went and they upzoned all their single family lots to now be able to, by right, allow for duplexes and triplexes. So any single family residence now could have a duplex or a triplex built on it without having to go through any kind of special hearing or trying to seek any kind of exemption. And that's, it's a seismic change in the way that we regulate our land use. It's one that signaled a change that Oregon picked up on, and as a state instituted this similar upzoning of single family zoning. And even here in Asheville or in Western North Carolina, we saw Senator Chuck Edwards introduce a bill. I'll touch on this a little bit later, but who introduced a bill to upzone single family zoning throughout North Carolina to allow for duplexes, triplexes, and quads in single families. As you can guess, it comes with a lot of controversy, but as I was saying, the previous, our existing zoning regulations right now set us up for really very limited choices in housing. And what it's ending up doing is it's cutting out an entire segment of housing that used to be very popular and provided for various forms of density in neighborhoods that were context sensitive and really, in many ways, deemed appropriate. Instead, what we find is on this scale, we are kind of stuck between choosing on, single family detached homes on the left and the mid-rise multifamily housing on the right. And so, we're kind of given this choice of trying to find a single family home at, ever escalating prices in neighborhoods that are becoming more and more exclusive and more segregated by income, or we're looking at these kind of massive multifamily developments with very little in between. And it strikes me as odd, particularly I live in West Asheville. I live in the Falconhurst neighborhood, and if I take a walk around my neighborhood, I can find all kinds of examples of missing middle housing that are right there in my neighborhood. It does, it adds to the character. It brings residents, rental units into our neighborhoods. So, we find a mix of income, a mix of race that comes with that mix of income. And we're finding all sorts of examples that already exist and have existed in this neighborhood for years, but we no longer build like this. It really makes me wonder why. When you can take a quarter-acre lot and you can place 6 units on that quarter acre versus a single-family home that would occupy that site, that's a huge increase in the capacity of our land to hold, to absorb this population that we were talking about. Even something as subtle as just like row housing, like here on Dunwell Ave, can provide a lot of housing on a very little bit of the land, and can give us the opportunity to absorb, this 50,000 people that we can expect over the next 50 years. We're even doing a lot of work with our streets to adapt and set ourselves up for this type of density. I mentioned at the outset that cities are where we want to build. That's where our infrastructure is already located. It's where our services are. It's where our jobs, for the most part, are. So it only makes sense that this is where we want people to live. And if we can concentrate people within our cities and our small towns, it makes it that much easier for us to manage our natural areas and to preserve the natural beauty and the services that they provide in our natural areas. So this is just a snapshot of Charlotte Street, and at the Charlotte and Chestnut intersection, where Charlotte Street has just recently undergone a road diet. We had a 4-lane road that was really inhospitable to bikes and had very narrow sidewalks lining the streets, one that a pedestrian never really felt comfortable traversing. And the city made the investment to change that. And we reduced it down to a single lane of traffic either way, with a turning lane down the middle, bike lanes on either side, and wider sidewalks as well, with pedestrian crossings on either, to be able to cross the road. And I think that we're finding from bicyclists, pedestrians, and motorists are all enjoying the experience much more now. It seems to be a very successful installation. So it should be no surprise that in making that investment in the roadway and creating something that is pedestrian and cyclist friendly and is really only an 8-minute walk from downtown. I mean, we're talking about a stone's throw from downtown. That now we're beginning to see development proposals in the Charlotte Street area that include more density. And so there's the 101 Charlotte Street block that right now has a number of single-family homes that are being rented and are kind of in various stages of decay. And there's a proposal right now on the table to redevelop that site. And that in doing so, it would add about 200 units, living units that you see here in yellow, to the block. And it would require the removal of these 12 or 13 historic homes. And it's important to note that Charlotte Street in this neighborhood is a historic district, and those homes are contributing homes to the historic district. So I certainly don't want to just glaze over that and just say, it's on balance, it's worthwhile to add more density and sacrifice historic structures in light of that. But I do think that it is worth noting that that there is an effort to bring density to this corridor, and it's a corridor that has been set up to absorb such density with the road diet that's been instituted. But it should be no surprise that you're looking at a 4-story structure, and to me that kind of hits the threshold in Asheville for when people begin to freak out. I think anything over 3 stories gets people to become a little bit concerned about what's happening to their neighborhood. And what's being proposed here is, certainly more in line with what you would expect from an urban corridor, and you can see the context that this would be developed in. Now, right across the street from the 101 block is the Fuddruckers site, and Fuddruckers is closed and moved. And right now, we just received another proposal for this site that would bring another, I think, 180 units to that corner. So now we're looking at another pretty dense development that would be brought to this node, to this Charlotte Street and Chestnut intersection. And no surprise, it's drawn a lot of ire from the community. And we're seeing it in the form of protests. There's a Save Charlotte Street effort that is underway. They lined the block with bed sheets, kind of harkening back to the 70s, 1970s effort to highlight the Asheville downtown mall and what would have been lost. Basically, all of Lexington Ave and everything between Haywood and Broadway would have been wiped out for an indoor mall. And the community really rallied against that project, and in part encircled the property in bed sheets to highlight what would be lost. So that technique was replicated here. But there's a lot of people that are concerned about bringing that kind of density to their neighborhood. They even staged a drive-in of sorts where they tried to add 100 cars to Charlotte Street on a given Friday. I guess this was a Friday or two ago, to highlight just the congestion that it would bring to that area. And I think the projections that I've seen, it adds maybe 30 seconds to the travel time for residents in that area, but it's still it's important to note that there is a lot of resistance to bringing this form of density, within a stone's throw of our downtown. There's a lot of community resistance to bringing that kind of density there. A lot of people will characterize it as NIMBYs, or not in my backyard. Folks that have had the good fortune of landing in this neighborhood, in a house that was developed in their neighborhood and probably displaced trees in the process, but nonetheless, once they're there, they want to be able to shut the door behind them, and it's just there's some. I think the fact that the area has single family zoning makes it that much easier to be able to resist. So it's going to require a change in zoning to bring that kind of density to the area. And when you bring that kind of change in zoning before our city council, that does leave it very susceptible to public pressure. And so that's why you're seeing these efforts, the protests and the drive-ins, to try and demonstrate that the community is dead set against this. So, as we resist bringing density, within a stone's throw of our downtown, it should be expected that that density is going to begin to trickle out. You would think that maybe if we brought that form of density, rather than in the form of, say, like 200 units at a time, which I think can be very jarring, and I understand that, that instead, if we were to visit this idea of missing middle housing, and if we were to bring density to these neighborhoods in a more incremental way, maybe through duplexes and triplexes, ways of bringing a little bit more density to each lot without overwhelming a community with 200 units at a time, that this would be more palatable. These are just some designs for duplexes and triplexes that the Asheville Design Center created for Habitat for Humanity. Habitat has for years prided itself on being a developer of single-family, affordable single-family units. But even Habitat has recognized the need for change and the need to adapt, and recognizing that as they build within the city limits, the need for density is there, and so they're open to exploring designs that will bring more density to their neighborhoods, and that comes in the form of these duplexes and triplexes. Well, it turns out that even if you were to try and bring something like that, you're going to find resistance. We're seeing communities that are becoming much more sophisticated in resisting development proposals in their neighborhoods. This is just a Instagram post from the Save Beaver Dam effort, where they are rallying against a high density development in their neighborhood. And as you can see, it's, the claim is to keep their community safe from high density development. I don't quite understand what the implication is of what high density development, how it endangers their community. But they're looking to protect homes, families, wildlife, trees. You would anticipate that with this type of reaction, that we must be talking about some kind of massive development, when instead what we're talking about is 10 triplexes on 6 acres of land that are already zoned for that density. So by right, the developer would have the ability to develop 10 triplexes, 30 units on 6 acres of land, and yet the community has rallied vehemently against it. And so, even when we try and bring more subtle forms of density to our neighborhoods, we're finding a lot of resistance to that. Ironically, I don't even know if the term ironic is proper here, but maybe hypocritically, while they are opposed to the development of 30 30 units in the form of triplexes, they are totally open to 10 single-family homes being developed on that lot. So, I believe that the claims for, protecting trees and protecting wildlife ring a little bit hollow when they're willing to develop that land, only they're willing to develop it as single-family homes and not as potential rental units. And it really makes me question, what's motivating that. So as I had mentioned, Senator Chuck Edwards introduced a bill earlier this year that would redefine single-family zoning to encompass duplexes, triplexes, and quads. This was something that actually gained bipartisan support, and as well, it found developers, the Home Builders Association, private property rights advocates, and new urbanists all on the same page, all advocating for something like this. Now, there is something to be said for this kind of top-down legislation of the state, legislating what the cities can do, and I would argue that the cities are more well-equipped to deal with this on a local level. But it is, we live in a state where it's a mother may I state. It's called Dillon's Rule, where we basically need state permission to be able to change something like this. And although Senator Edwards introduced this bill, it did not gain the kind of support it needed to be able to take root. I think it did introduce a really good concept to us, and it was one that our Coalition of Asheville Neighborhoods, their executive committee, actually took a stance against it. And there's an argument that by introducing duplexes and triplexes into these neighborhoods, that we will fundamentally change the character of these neighborhoods. Again, I'm just going to point back to the Falconhurst, Brucemont neighborhoods, and really every neighborhood in Nashville that already has this form of housing in it. And we have courtyard apartments and cottage clusters located within these neighborhoods. They've been part of the context for over nearly 100 years. This is not a grand departure from how we develop. And I do think that if we're going to be able to find ways to absorb the 50,000+ people that are going to be moving here in the next generation or so, we're going to have to find ways to build. And the only way to solve the affordable housing crisis is to build more affordable housing. And if we are not able to build near our cities, and if we're not able to build outside our cities, then we're only going to be forcing that development even further out. This is a sky view of the proposed River Bluffs development in Woodfin, right in the Richmond Hill area, where they're proposing to bring 1,400 units to a completely forested area. So we talk about the loss of trees, maybe on the 101 Charlotte Street area, and the loss of call it several dozen trees, perhaps. The losses that we face as we push this development further outside of our cities into what I would say are more inappropriate areas to be concentrating so much density. We're really just bringing this density into areas that are already natural areas that are providing us with plenty of services for clean water and clean air, and we're going to be chewing that land up even faster. It's going to induce so much more sprawl if we can't find a way to build within our city limits. We see it also right on the edges of our city. We no longer have what's known as extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is basically a mile-wide buffer around the city that the city had some control over how that development was being managed. And we've lost. That's another thing that our state legislature has taken away from us. So we are now seeing proposals right on the edge of the city that are bringing density. This was originally 800 units, I think scaled back to 620 units, right on Hominy Creek, right opposite the Malvern Hills neighborhood. We're going to continue to see more and more proposals like this, and I would project that we'll see this type of development eventually find its way to valleys like the Big Ivy Valley, which is only about 30 miles or 30 minutes outside of Asheville. And once we complete I-26, we're going to make the commute from Big Ivy to Asheville that much easier. It's only going to induce development on some beautifully flat land, which is so hard to find in our region, owned by a number of farmers that are over 60 years old. And we're going to see those properties begin to turn over. And I think it's only it should be expected that if we can't find ways to bring that density to our city, we're going to be pushing that density to areas like Big Ivy. And if we do that, then we're going to find that the highways that we're building today are probably no longer suitable for the volumes of traffic that we're going to be generating in 20 to 30 years, and that's only going to mean that we're going to need a bigger boat. So with that, I will wrap it up, and if you all have any questions, I welcome them. Thanks again for joining us, and there's my contact information on the screen if you'd like to follow up with me. Opposing viewpoints are welcomed. I always welcome a debate on these issues. So thanks so much. Susan?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That was outstanding. I don't see any questions that have come in yet, so we might give it another minute. See who has follow-ups for your fabulous presentation. And if not, we will call this good, wrap it up for the day, and you guys can contact Chris later should you choose.
I see one Q&A.
That popped up. Good eyes. Sure. Oh, fantastic presentation. Thank you for your work. Hey. Well, I might go ahead and stop the recording. You guys